Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Take a moment to settle in, to let the day begin its slow fade behind you. Before we begin, let yourself get truly comfortable. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? A quiet room where the evening has finally settled. A cozy space where you can let your mind wander back through time. Tonight we're going to explore the Golden Age of Islamic science, a period of nearly 500 years when Baghdad and the wider Islamic world became the intellectual centre of human civilization. We'll discover the scholars who preserved ancient wisdom when Europe had forgotten it, the scientists who invented algebra and described the laws of optics, and the philosophers who ask questions that still echo through our world today. It's a journey that spans from the 8th century to the 13th, from the banks of the Tigris River to libraries that held 500,000 books, from forgotten Greek texts to discoveries that change mathematics forever. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a dry recitation of dates and names. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through this remarkable period, meeting the people who lived it, understanding what they discovered and why it mattered, and contemplating what it means that human knowledge can flourish anywhere, in any time, when curiosity is valued and learning is honoured. By the end, I think you'll find a kind of peace in knowing that wisdom has always travelled, always found new homes, always survived. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's quieter corners, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for making this community what it is. So settle in now. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath, deeper than the last few you've taken today. And let's begin our slow drift back through 12 centuries, to a time when the most advanced science on earth was written in Arabic, when the brightest minds gathered in a city by a river, when the world's knowledge found a new home. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to do. Just listen and let the story unfold. Let's begin where all the great stories of Baghdad begin, with the river itself. The Tigris runs through what we now call Iraq, flowing southward from mountains in the north toward the Persian Gulf, and along its banks, humans have built civilizations for 5,000 years. The ancient Assyrians knew this river. The Babylonians raised their gardens here. The Persians built their empire with 1 foot on each bank, and in the year 762, a new city began to rise beside these same waters, a city that would become, for a time, the centre of the world. The caliph who ordered Baghdad's construction was named Al-Mansur, and he chose the location with great care. Here, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers run close together, creating natural trade routes. Caravans from the east, carrying silk and spices from China and India, passed through on their way to the Mediterranean. Ships sailed up from the Persian Gulf loaded with goods from distant shores. The location wasn't just strategic for trade, it was strategic for ideas. Because in this era, ideas travelled the same routes that merchants did, carried in the minds of travellers, written on pages tucked carefully into saddlebags, preserved in the memories of scholars seeking new teachers. Al-Mansur built his city in a circle, with massive walls and 4 gates oriented to the cardinal directions. At the centre stood the caliph's palace and the grand mosque, and radiating outward were gardens, libraries and the homes of scholars. The city was called Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, though history would remember it simply as Baghdad. Within a generation, it had grown into one of the largest cities on earth, home to perhaps 500,000 people at its height. But more than its size, more than its walls or its markets, Baghdad became known for something else entirely. It became known as a place where questions were welcome, where old books were treasured and new ideas were tested, where a scholar could find patronage and support for the strange work of simply trying to understand how the world worked. The caliphs who ruled from Baghdad, particularly during what historians call the Abbasid period, did something unusual for rulers of any age. They spent their wealth not just on armies and palaces, but on knowledge itself. They collected books, they hired translators, they built institutions dedicated to learning, and in doing so they created the conditions for something remarkable. What we're about to explore together wasn't the work of one person, or even one generation. It was the accumulated effort of hundreds of scholars over hundreds of years, building on each other's work, preserving old wisdom, and creating new understanding. It happened because the conditions were right. Because trade routes connected distant places. Because the Arabic language could serve as a common tongue across a vast empire. Because rulers were willing to support work that had no immediate practical value. And because individual human beings, whose names we'll come to know, devoted their lives to questions that fascinated them. This is the world we're entering now, slowly and carefully. A world where libraries held treasures, where mathematics advanced in ways that still shape how we think, where medicine developed techniques that would save lives for centuries. It's a world that deserves to be remembered not as exotic or foreign, but as deeply human, as part of the long story of our species trying to make sense of our existence. And it begins here, by a river, in a circular city, in the year 762. In the early years of Baghdad, something extraordinary was happening in workshops and studies across the city. Scholars were gathering books, ancient texts written in Greek and Syriac and Sanskrit and Persian, and they were translating them into Arabic. This might not sound revolutionary at first, but consider what it meant. The great works of Greek philosophy, mathematics, and medicine had been written hundreds of years earlier, many of them lost or forgotten in the lands where they originated. Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's treatises on logic and nature, Euclid's geometry, Ptolemy's astronomy, Galen's medical texts. All of these existed in scattered manuscripts, often incomplete. Sometimes in languages fewer and fewer people could read. The early Abbasid caliphs recognized something important. They understood that knowledge itself was a form of wealth, perhaps the most valuable form, and so they began what historians call the translation movement, a systematic effort to gather and translate the wisdom of previous civilizations. This wasn't just about preserving old books, though that was part of it. It was about making knowledge accessible, about creating a foundation on which new understanding could be built. Because you cannot advance human knowledge if you don't know what's already been discovered. You'll spend your life rediscovering things others already knew, reinventing methods others already perfected. The work was painstaking and required deep expertise. A translator needed to know not just the languages involved, but the subjects themselves. You couldn't translate a medical text if you didn't understand medicine. You couldn't render Greek mathematical proofs into Arabic if you didn't understand the mathematics. And so the translation workshops became centres of learning themselves, places where scholars gathered to debate not just the words but the ideas behind them. Often, multiple scholars would work on a single text, comparing their interpretations, checking their work against each other's understanding. Some translators became famous in their own right. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian scholar from Al-Hira, learned Greek specifically so he could translate medical texts, and he became so skilled that his translations of Galen were considered superior to later ones made directly from Greek to Latin. He didn't just translate words. He understood the medicine deeply enough to clarify Galen's sometimes confusing explanations, to add helpful notes, to create something that was both faithful to the original and more useful than it. This was translation as an intellectual act, not just a linguistic one. The movement accelerated under Caliph al-Ma'mun, who ruled from 813 to 833. Al-Ma'mun was himself a scholar, fascinated by philosophy and science, and he established what would become the most famous institution of learning in the Islamic Golden Age. But we'll come to that soon. For now, what matters is understanding that the translation movement created something unprecedented. It gathered the knowledge of Greece, Persia, India, and other civilizations, and made it available in a single language, accessible across a vast empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. This meant that a scholar in Cordoba could read the same Aristotle as a scholar in Samarkand. Ideas could travel faster, build on each other more quickly, and crucially, the act of translation itself often led to new insights. When you have to explain something in a different language, you often understand it more deeply. You notice ambiguities in the original, contradictions that need resolving, assumptions that don't quite translate. The very act of translation became a form of scholarship, a way of questioning and understanding. And this brings us to something equally important. The translation movement wasn't just about looking backward to ancient wisdom. It was about creating the foundation for looking forward, for new discovery. Because once you have access to everything that's been known before, you can begin to see where the gaps are, where the questions remain unanswered, where the old explanations don't quite work. You can begin to imagine what might come next, and in Baghdad, in workshops and libraries and private studies across the Islamic world, scholars were beginning to do exactly that. Imagine a library that holds not hundreds but thousands of manuscripts, where scholars from different lands work side by side, where translators labour over ancient Greek, while mathematicians develop new theorems in the next room, where astronomical instruments are built and tested on the roof. This was the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, established in Baghdad during the early 9th century. Its exact founding date is debated, and what it precisely was is still discussed by historians. But what's clear is that it became a symbol of the age's commitment to learning. The House of Wisdom was likely several things at once. It was certainly a library, housing texts gathered from across the known world. It was probably a translation centre, where much of the work we discussed in the last chapter took place. It may have been a school or academy where scholars gathered to teach and learn. And it was definitely a place of patronage, where the caliph's support allowed intellectuals to pursue their work. Think of it less as a single building, and more as an idea made institutional, the idea that learning itself deserved society's resources and protection. Caliph al-Ma'mun, who we mentioned earlier, is credited with expanding the House of Wisdom into something truly remarkable. According to the stories, he didn't just wait for books to come to Baghdad. He sent emissaries to Constantinople, to Alexandria, to any place that might hold ancient manuscripts, offering gold for texts, paying translators travel expenses, doing whatever was necessary to bring knowledge to his city. Some accounts suggest he even made it a condition of peace treaties with the Byzantine Empire that they hand over Greek manuscripts. Whether these specific stories are true or embellished, they capture something real about the value placed on learning in this time and place. The scholars who worked at the House of Wisdom came from remarkably diverse backgrounds. Some were Muslim, certainly, but many were Christian or Jewish or followed other traditions. What mattered was expertise, dedication to learning, the ability to contribute to the shared project of understanding. This pluralism wasn't just tolerance. It was recognition that wisdom has no single source, that truth can be found anywhere, that the questions worth asking transcend any individual tradition. A Christian translator might work on Aristotle, a Muslim mathematician on algebra, a Persian physician on medical texts, all in the same institution, all supported by the same patronage system. The working methods were rigorous and collaborative. When a new text arrived, multiple scholars might review it, checking it against other versions if any existed, debating difficult passages, sometimes producing multiple translations to capture different aspects of the original. Marginalia from this period shows scholars arguing with each other in the margins of manuscripts, questioning translations, proposing alternatives. This wasn't passive reception of ancient wisdom. It was active engagement, critical thinking applied even to revered texts. The astronomical work done at the House of Wisdom was particularly notable. Scholars built instruments to measure the positions of stars and planets with unprecedented precision. They conducted observations that would correct errors in Ptolemy's ancient star charts. They calculated the circumference of the Earth using careful geometric reasoning and actual measurements taken at different latitudes. This required not just theoretical knowledge but practical skill, the ability to design and build instruments, to organise expeditions, to coordinate observations across vast distances. But perhaps what's most moving about the House of Wisdom, looking back across 12 centuries, is what it represents. It represents a choice made by people with wealth and power to spend that wealth and power on something that wouldn't immediately make them richer or more powerful. They chose to support people who wanted to understand how the eye perceives light, how numbers relate to each other, why planets move in particular paths across the sky. They chose to preserve knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, and in doing so they gave humanity a gift whose value we're still discovering. The House of Wisdom wouldn't last forever. Nothing does. But for a time, perhaps 200 years at its height, it stood as proof that human curiosity, when supported and honoured, can create something that outlasts any individual life. The books translated there, the discoveries made there, the methods refined there would eventually spread to Europe and help spark the Renaissance. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, we're still in 9th century Baghdad, where the real work of science was just beginning. There's a man whose name you probably haven't heard, but whose influence touches your life every single day. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, and he worked as a scholar at the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century. We don't know much about his personal life, which is often the case with figures from this distant past, but we know what he created, and it changed mathematics forever. Around the year 820, Al-Khwarizmi wrote a book. Its full title in English would be something like _0_, though it's usually referred to by just one word from its Arabic title, Algebra. From that single word, Algebra, meaning completion or restoration, we get our word algebra. Al-Khwarizmi didn't invent every algebraic concept, of course. Mathematics builds cumulatively, each generation adding to what came before, but what he did was revolutionary nonetheless. Before Al-Khwarizmi, if you wanted to solve mathematical problems, you generally worked with specific numbers, concrete examples. You might know methods for solving particular types of problems, but these were often treated as separate techniques, not part of a unified system. What Al-Khwarizmi did was create a systematic approach to solving equations using what we now call variables, unknown quantities represented by symbols that could stand for any number. This might seem obvious now, so familiar that it's hard to see how radical it was. But imagine being the first person to clearly articulate that you could manipulate these unknown quantities according to logical rules, that you could balance an equation by doing the same thing to both sides. His book presented 6 types of equations and systematic methods for solving each one. He worked through examples carefully, showing not just the answer, but the reasoning that led there. And crucially, he didn't just give the methods. He explained why they worked, providing geometric proofs that demonstrated the logical foundations of algebraic techniques. This combination of practical method and theoretical justification would become a hallmark of Islamic mathematics. Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra was written in words, not the symbolic notation we use today. He would write out, a square plus 10 times its root equals 39, rather than writing x squared plus 10x equals 39. The symbolism would come later, developed over centuries by many mathematicians. But the logical structure, the understanding that equations could be manipulated according to consistent rules, the recognition that general methods could solve whole classes of problems, all of that was there in Al-Khwarizmi's book. He wrote other influential works as well. His book on Hindu-Arabic numerals helped introduce the decimal system to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. This was the number system we still use today, the one that includes 0 as a placeholder and allows for positional notation. Al-Khwarizmi didn't invent these numerals, they came from India, but he explained them clearly and showed their practical advantages over the Roman numerals still used in Europe. The very word algorithm comes from the Latinized version of his name, a testament to his influence on systematic mathematical thinking. What's remarkable is how practical his work was. even as it dealt with abstract mathematical concepts. The preface to his algebra book explains that he wrote it to address __quote_for__ mathematics wasn't just theoretical pursuit for its own sake. It was a tool for solving real problems, for helping people divide estates fairly, conduct business honestly, understand the world around them. Al-Khwarizmi worked in an intellectual environment that valued both pure and applied mathematics, that saw no contradiction between abstract theory and practical utility. This balance, this sense that mathematics could be both beautiful in its own right and useful in daily life, characterizes much of Islamic Golden Age science. Scholars weren't choosing between understanding and application. They were pursuing both, recognizing that deep understanding often leads to better applications, and that practical problems often reveal theoretical insights. When we use algebra today, when we solve equations or write computer algorithms, we're using methods that Al-Khwarizmi helped develop 1200 years ago in Baghdad. His work was translated into Latin in the 12th century and became the foundation for European mathematics. But long before that, it transformed Islamic mathematics, enabling new approaches to geometry, astronomy, and engineering. One person, one book, written carefully in a workshop by a river, changed the course of human thought. And he was just one scholar among many in this remarkable age. Look up at the night sky, if you can, wherever you are. Or imagine it, if clouds or city lights obscure your view, those points of light, the planets wandering among fixed stars, the moon waxing and waning, the whole vast celestial dome turning overhead. Humans have watched this sky for as long as we've been human, finding patterns, telling stories, trying to understand what we were seeing. In the Islamic Golden Age, astronomy became one of the most advanced sciences, combining careful observation with sophisticated mathematics, practical needs with theoretical insight. There were several reasons why astronomy flourished in this time and place. One was religious. Determining the correct times for the 5 daily prayers required astronomical knowledge. Finding the direction of Mecca from any location on Earth was a problem in spherical geometry. Establishing the beginning of each lunar month, especially Ramadan, demanded careful observation of the moon, so there were practical, immediate reasons to become expert at observing and predicting celestial phenomena. But astronomy became much more than a tool for religious observance. It became a science pursued for its own sake, because the sky was beautiful and mysterious and worthy of understanding. Islamic astronomers inherited a rich tradition from several sources. From the Greeks, particularly Ptolemy, came sophisticated geometric models of planetary motion. From the Persians and Indians came alternative mathematical techniques and observational records. Islamic scholars didn't just accept these inherited traditions uncritically. They tested them, looking for places where predictions didn't match observations, where the models seemed mathematically awkward or philosophically troubling, and when they found problems, they developed alternatives. One of the most sophisticated astronomical instruments of this era was the astrolabe. This wasn't an Islamic invention. The basic principles came from Greek astronomy, but Islamic craftsmen perfected it, making astrolabes that were both scientifically precise and works of art. An astrolabe is essentially a model of the celestial sphere, a device that allows you to solve problems in spherical astronomy through mechanical means. With an astrolabe, you could determine the time from the position of the sun or stars, find the direction of Mecca, calculate when prayers should occur, determine the positions of planets, even predict eclipses. The best astrolabes were engineering marvels. They required precise metalworking, accurate engraving of degree markings, careful calculation of the relationships between different components. Some were small enough to fit in your palm, yet accurate enough to solve complex astronomical problems. They represented the integration of theoretical understanding, mathematical precision, and practical craftsmanship. And they were beautiful, often decorated with intricate geometric patterns, inscribed with poetry, made from brass or silver that caught the light. Observatories were built across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Damascus to Samarkand, each equipped with large instruments for measuring positions of stars and planets. These weren't casual observations. Astronomers would track planets night after night for years, creating records of unprecedented accuracy. They would measure star positions, comparing their results to Ptolemy's ancient star catalogue, discovering errors and making corrections. They calculated the length of the year with remarkable precision, accurate to within minutes of modern measurements. This work required not just individual brilliance, but institutional support and collaborative effort. An observatory needed funding for instruments, salaries for observers, libraries to house records and reference texts. It needed a culture that valued precision, that was willing to repeat measurements many times to ensure accuracy, that could maintain continuity over decades as one generation of astronomers passed their work to the next. The Islamic world in this period created such institutions, recognizing that understanding the heavens was worth the investment. Some astronomical work had immediate practical applications. Better understanding of planetary positions improved astrology, which in that era was taken seriously as a predictive science. Navigation benefited from improved star charts. Calendar calculations became more accurate. But much of the work was driven by something else entirely, by the desire to understand, by the beauty of mathematical patterns in celestial motions, by the simple wonder of the night sky. The astronomer Ibn al-Haytham, whose work we'll explore more deeply later, wrote that he pursued science because of his _5_ not for any practical benefit. And perhaps that's what moves us most, looking back. These were people who looked at the same sky we see and asked the same questions we ask. How far away are those stars? Why do planets move in those particular patterns? What's the shape and size of the Earth? Can we predict eclipses? Can we understand the cosmos? They didn't have our instruments or our mathematics, but they had the same curiosity, the same drive to understand. And working with astrolabes and observation platforms with careful mathematics and patient record keeping, they pushed human knowledge forward, one observation at a time. The work they did under that ancient sky still informs how we understand the universe today. In the city of Ray, near modern Tehran, a physician named Muhammad ibn Zakaria Al-Razi ran a hospital in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. We know him in the West as Rhazes, the Latinized version of his name, but in his own time and place, he was simply known as Al-Razi. And he approached medicine with a combination of clinical experience, careful observation, and intellectual courage that was remarkable for any era. Al-Razi wrote prolifically. His comprehensive book of medicine ran to 23 volumes and attempted to collect all known medical knowledge of his time. It included Greek medicine from Galen and Hippocrates, Indian medical traditions, Persian medical texts, and Al-Razi's own clinical observations from decades of practice. But he didn't just compile others' knowledge. He questioned it, tested it, and wasn't afraid to disagree with even the most revered authorities when his experience suggested they were wrong. This was unusual. Ancient medical authorities like Galen were treated almost as infallible by many physicians. Their texts were studied, memorized, commented upon, but rarely directly challenged. Al-Razi took a different approach. He believed that clinical observation should take precedence over textual authority. If Galen said one thing but the patient in front of you showed something different, you trusted what you could see and measure, not what the ancient text claimed. This empirical approach, this willingness to question authority based on evidence, was central to Al-Razi's method. One of his most famous works is a treatise on measles and smallpox, the first clear medical description that distinguished between these two diseases. Before Al-Razi, both were often confused as a single affliction. He carefully described the symptoms of each, the progression of the diseases, how they differed from each other, and how they should be treated. His descriptions were so precise that the book remained a standard medical text for centuries. He wrote from experience, having treated hundreds of cases, and his clinical eye was remarkably acute. But Al-Razi's contributions went beyond individual treatises. He helped establish what we might call the scientific method in medicine, the principle that claims should be tested against observation, that theories should be modified when evidence contradicts them, that medicine should be based on repeatable experience rather than philosophical speculation or textual tradition. He kept careful case notes, recording symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. He conducted what we might call clinical trials, testing different treatments for the same condition to see which worked better. His approach extended to medical ethics as well. Al-Razi believed physicians had a duty to treat all patients regardless of their wealth or social status. He wrote about the importance of bedside manner, of speaking honestly with patients, of not raising false hopes but also not abandoning hope when it existed. He was, by the accounts we have, not just a skilled physician but a compassionate one, who saw medicine as fundamentally about caring for human suffering. Al-Razi also wrote philosophical works that got him in trouble with religious authorities. He questioned whether revealed religion was necessary, suggesting that human reason alone was sufficient for moral and philosophical understanding. These were controversial positions, and some of his philosophical writings were destroyed or suppressed. But they show a mind unwilling to accept boundaries on inquiry, willing to question any authority, divine or human, when reason suggested alternatives. There's something deeply humane about Al-Razi's approach to medicine. He recognized the limits of medical knowledge in his time. He knew there were many diseases medicine couldn't cure, many conditions it couldn't even properly explain. But rather than pretending to certainty he didn't possess, rather than resorting to elaborate theories that explained everything while curing nothing, he focused on what he could observe, what he could test, what actually seemed to help patients. This honesty, this empirical humility combined with intellectual boldness, made him one of the most influential physicians of the medieval world. When his works were translated into Latin in the Middle Ages, they became standard texts in European medical education. Medical students in Bologna and Paris studied Al-Razi's clinical observations, learned from his case studies, absorbed his empirical approach. The hospitals he helped design, with separate wards for different diseases, with an emphasis on cleanliness and patient care, became models for medical institutions across the Islamic world and eventually beyond. One physician in one city, questioning everything, trusting his observations, carefully recording what he learned, changed how humanity practiced medicine. If Al-Razi was medicine's great questioner, Ibn Sina was its great synthesizer. Known in the West as Avicenna, Ibn Sina lived from 980 to 1037, and in his 57 years, he produced an astonishing body of work that covered medicine, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and more. But it's his medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, that became perhaps the most influential medical text in history. Ibn Sina was a polymath in an age of polymaths, a person whose interests and expertise ranged across what we would now consider separate disciplines. He believed that medicine and philosophy were intimately connected, that you couldn't truly understand the body without understanding the nature of existence itself, that healing required not just technical knowledge, but wisdom about human nature and the nature of reality. This holistic approach, seeing medicine as part of a larger intellectual framework, characterized his work. The Canon of Medicine is massive. Over 1 million words organized into 5 books. The first book covers general principles, the theory of medicine, what Ibn Sina calls the quote 6 and quote 7 that make up the body. The second book discusses simple drugs and their properties, listing hundreds of substances and their medical uses. The third book addresses diseases organized by body system, from head to toe. The fourth covers systemic diseases and conditions. The fifth discusses compound medicines and antidotes. Together, it represented an attempt to create a complete system of medical knowledge. What made the canon so influential wasn't just its comprehensiveness, but its organization. Ibn Sina had a genius for systematic thinking, for taking vast amounts of information and organizing it logically, making it accessible and usable. Medical students could find information quickly, could understand how different pieces of knowledge related to each other, could see the underlying principles that unified diverse observations. It was both an encyclopedia and a textbook, both a reference work and a guide to medical thinking. Ibn Sina built on Greek medical theory, particularly Galen, but he modified and corrected it based on clinical observation and logical analysis. He discussed the contagious nature of some diseases, suggesting that they spread through invisible particles, a remarkable anticipation of germ theory made 600 years before microscopes could actually reveal bacteria. He described meningitis, distinguished mediastinal tumours from other chest masses, provided the first known descriptions of many diseases that still carry the names he gave them in Arabic. His work on pharmacology was particularly advanced. He discussed not just what substances could be used medicinally, but how they should be prepared, how different preparation methods affected their properties, how substances could be combined to create more effective medicines. He understood that the same substance in different forms or dosages could have different effects, that timing and method of administration mattered, that medicine was as much art as science. But perhaps what's most impressive about Ibn Sina is how he thought about the relationship between mind and body, between psychological and physical health. He recognized that emotional states could cause physical symptoms, that what we'd now call psychosomatic illness was real illness, not imagined. He developed clever diagnostic techniques that relied on understanding this connection. One famous story, perhaps apocryphal but illustrative, tells of Ibn Sina diagnosing lovesickness in a young man by taking his pulse while mentioning different women's names, watching for the sudden acceleration that revealed the object of hidden affection. The canon was translated into Latin in the 12th century and became the standard medical textbook in European universities. It was taught at Montpellier and Bologna, at Paris and Vienna. For 500 years, medical students across Europe learned from Ibn Sina's systematization of medical knowledge. Even after new discoveries began to supersede parts of his system, the canon remained influential because of its method, its way of organizing and thinking about medical knowledge systematically. Ibn Sina's philosophical works were equally influential, particularly his synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic theology. But it's in medicine that his influence was most direct and lasting. He took the accumulated medical knowledge of Greek, Persian, and Islamic physicians and created something new, a systematic framework that was both comprehensive and practical, both theoretically sophisticated and clinically useful. What moves us about Ibn Sina looking back is his faith in human reason and observation. He believed that careful study and logical thinking could unlock the secrets of the human body, could alleviate suffering, could save lives. He was right. Not in every detail. Medicine has advanced enormously since his time, but in the fundamental approach, systematic observation, logical organization, rigorous thinking applied to clinical problems, these principles remain central to medicine today, and they found one of their clearest expressions in the work of a brilliant physician writing by lamplight in 11th century Persia. There's a question that seems simple until you really think about it. How do we see? What's happening when light from an object reaches our eyes and we perceive that object? The ancient Greeks had various theories. Some thought that eyes emitted rays that touched objects. Some thought that objects emitted something that entered the eyes. Some had hybrid theories combining both. But in 11th century Cairo, a mathematician and physicist named Ibn al-Haytham conducted a series of experiments that revolutionized our understanding of vision and light itself. Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Razi, was born in Basra around 965 and spent much of his career in Cairo under the patronage of the Fatimid caliphs. According to legend, he once claimed he could regulate the flooding of the Nile, was summoned to Cairo to demonstrate this, realized it was impossible, and then feigned madness to avoid the caliph's wrath, remaining in confinement until the caliph's death. Whether this story is true or not, we know he lived in Cairo, and produced there one of the most important works of medieval science, the Book of Optics. The Book of Optics, or Kitab al-Manazir, is remarkable for many reasons, but perhaps most notably for its systematic use of experimental method. Ibn al-Haytham didn't just theorize about light, he conducted experiments carefully designed to test specific hypotheses, to isolate variables, to prove or disprove particular claims. This experimental approach, combined with mathematical analysis of the results, was revolutionary. He wasn't the first to experiment, but the rigour and systematization of his method set new standards. He demonstrated conclusively that vision works through light entering the eye from objects, not through the eye emitting anything. He did this through a series of elegant experiments. He showed that looking at bright lights could damage the eye, which wouldn't happen if the eye was actively projecting vision outward. He demonstrated that we can't see in complete darkness, that vision requires external light. He explored how images form in the eye using the camera obscura, a darkened chamber with a small hole that projects an inverted image of the outside world. His work on the camera obscura was particularly significant. He understood that light travels in straight lines, that each point on an illuminated object emits light in all directions, and that when light from different points passes through a small opening, it creates an inverted image on the opposite surface. This understanding of linear propagation of light and point-to-point correspondence between object and image was fundamental to later developments in optics and photography. Ibn al-Haytham also studied reflection and refraction, the bending of light when it passes from one medium to another. He measured angles of incidence and refraction for various materials, seeking mathematical relationships. While he didn't discover Snell's law, that would come centuries later, he made substantial progress toward it and understood that there was a regular mathematical relationship governing refraction. His measurements were remarkably precise for the instruments available to him. Perhaps what's most striking about Ibn al-Haytham's approach is his combination of mathematical rigour and experimental verification. He would propose a mathematical model of how light should behave, then design experiments to test whether light actually behaved that way. If it didn't, he would revise the model. This back and forth between theory and experiment, this insistence that theoretical explanations must match observed reality, is the essence of the scientific method. And Ibn al-Haytham practiced it with a sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for several more centuries. His influence on later science was enormous. When the Book of Optics was translated into Latin in the late 12th or early 13th century, it revolutionized European thinking about light and vision. Roger Bacon, Johannes Kepler, René Descartes, all the great optical theorists of the Renaissance and early modern period, built on Ibn al-Haytham's foundation. Kepler's understanding of how images form in the eye came directly from studying Al-Haytham. The development of eyeglasses, telescopes and microscopes all relied on optical principles that Ibn al-Haytham helped establish. But beyond specific discoveries, what Ibn al-Haytham gave to science was a model of how to proceed. He showed that natural phenomena could be understood through a combination of careful observation, controlled experiment, and mathematical analysis. He demonstrated that you could test theories, that you weren't limited to endless philosophical debate about what must be true based on first principles. You could look and measure and calculate and know. This epistemological stance, this confidence that nature could be interrogated and understood, was as important as any specific discovery. There's something almost modern about reading Ibn al-Haytham. His experimental design, his attention to controlling variables, his willingness to reject beautiful theories when experiment contradicted them, all of this feels familiar to anyone trained in modern science. And yet he was working 1,000 years ago, in a world without universities as we know them, without scientific journals or peer review, without the institutional frameworks that support modern research. He had to create the framework himself, to develop the methods from scratch, to prove through the quality of his work that this approach to understanding nature could succeed. Mathematics in the Islamic Golden Age flowered in ways both practical and beautiful, developing ideas that would shape human thought for centuries to come. We've already met Al-Khwarizmi and his algebra, but he was just one mathematician among many, and algebra was just one branch of a rich mathematical tradition. Let's wander through this garden of numbers together, taking time to appreciate some of the blooms. Consider geometry, the study of shapes and spaces. Islamic mathematicians inherited Euclidean geometry from the Greeks, but they didn't merely preserve it. They extended it, finding new proofs, discovering new theorems, applying geometric reasoning to new problems. Omar Khayyam, known in the West primarily as a poet, was also a brilliant mathematician who solved cubic equations using geometric constructions, finding solutions through the intersection of conic sections. This was sophisticated work, demonstrating a deep understanding of both algebra and geometry and the relationships between them. The study of conic sections, parabolas, ellipses, hyperbolas, advanced significantly. These curves, formed by slicing a cone at different angles, had fascinated Greek mathematicians, but Islamic scholars explored them more thoroughly, understanding their properties more deeply. Finding applications in optics and astronomy, Ibn al-Haytham used conic sections to solve optical problems. Astronomers used them to model planetary orbits. The mathematical beauty of these curves was appreciated for its own sake, but their utility made them even more worthy of study. Trigonometry, essential for astronomy and many practical calculations, was systematically developed. Islamic mathematicians created the first tables of sines, cosines, and tangents. Calculated to high precision, they developed formulas for spherical trigonometry, essential for astronomy since the celestial sphere is, well, spherical. These tables and formulas became tools that other scientists could use without having to derive everything themselves. They represented the accumulated computational work of generations, preserved in carefully copied manuscripts, available to anyone who needed them. Number theory, the study of properties of integers, attracted attention as well. What we call the fundamental theorem of arithmetic, that every integer greater than 1 can be uniquely expressed as a product of prime numbers, was understood and used. Perfect numbers, figurate numbers, amicable numbers, all these special classes of numbers were studied, partly for their own intrinsic interest, partly for mystical or numerological reasons, and partly just for the sheer pleasure of discovering patterns. But perhaps what's most distinctive about Islamic mathematics is its attention to practical applications alongside theoretical development. Mathematicians wrote treatises on practical arithmetic for merchants, explaining how to calculate profits and losses, how to convert between different currencies, how to measure land and calculate areas. They wrote about inheritance law, which under Islamic law could involve complex fractional divisions of estates, requiring sophisticated mathematics to apply fairly. Theory and practice supported each other, each driving development in the other. The visual expression of mathematics in Islamic art is stunning and worthy of contemplation. Geometric patterns in mosque decorations, in tile work, in manuscript illuminations, demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of symmetry, tessellation, and pattern generation. These aren't just decorations, they're mathematical explorations rendered in tile and stone and ink. The artisans who created them understood group theory, understood transformation and symmetry, even if they didn't use those modern mathematical terms. Their work was both beautiful and intellectually deep. Scholars have debated whether Islamic religious prohibition against representational art in some contexts drove the development of geometric art, which then fed back into mathematical thinking. Whatever the causal relationships, what's clear is that there was a culture that valued mathematical pattern, that saw beauty in geometric regularity, that created spaces where mathematical thinking and aesthetic appreciation reinforced each other. Walking through the Alhambra in Granada or the Shah Mosque in Isfahan, you're walking through mathematics made visible, through proof that abstraction can be beautiful. The transmission of mathematical knowledge was carefully organised. Scholars wrote commentaries on earlier works, explaining difficult passages, adding new examples, sometimes correcting errors. Students would study a text with a teacher who had studied it with his teacher, creating chains of transmission stretching back generations. This oral component of learning, this personal transmission from teacher to student, complemented the written texts and ensured that the tradition remained living, not just preserved in books. And always there was the sense that mathematics was worth pursuing for its own sake, for the beauty and elegance of its truths. Yes, it had applications in commerce and astronomy and engineering. Yes, it was useful. But it was also simply fascinating, a way of understanding the abstract patterns that underlie reality. A proof could be appreciated the way we appreciate poetry, for its elegance and inevitability. A solution could be beautiful, quite apart from any practical utility. This aesthetic dimension of mathematics, this recognition that mathematical truth has a kind of beauty, pervades the mathematical works of this period. When we use mathematics today, when we calculate interest or measure distances or design buildings, we're using methods refined in Baghdad and Cairo and Samarkand 1,000 years ago. But more than specific techniques, we've inherited an attitude, a sense that mathematics is both useful and beautiful, both practical and profound, both tool and art. That dual appreciation, that refusal to choose between utility and beauty, is part of the legacy of Islamic mathematical thought. In workshops across the Islamic world, scholars hunted for secrets hidden in matter itself. They heated substances in crucibles, mixed liquids in glass vessels, distilled and condensed and crystallized, searching for transformations. They were alchemists, and while their goals often seem fantastical to us, turning base metals into gold, finding the elixir of life, their methods were surprisingly rigorous, and their legacy is chemistry itself. The most famous of these alchemists was Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber, who lived in the 8th century. Hundreds of works were attributed to him, far more than one person could have written, suggesting that quote 8 became a name attached to a whole tradition of alchemical writing. But whoever wrote under this name or names, the works attributed to Jabir systematized alchemical knowledge in unprecedented ways. They describe laboratory equipment, chemical processes, specific substances and their properties. They provided recipes, instructions that could be followed, procedures that could be replicated. Jabir's works described processes like distillation and crystallization in detail. They discussed how to purify substances, how to identify them, how to work with acids and bases. They classified substances systematically, grouping them by properties and behaviors. This systematic approach, this attention to reproducible procedures, this careful description of materials and methods, all of this would become central to chemistry. The alchemical goal of transmutation might have been unreachable, but the methods developed in pursuit of it were scientifically sound. The equipment alchemists developed or refined became the basic toolkit of chemistry. The alembic, a distillation apparatus for separating liquids based on boiling points. The retort, a glass vessel with a long downward-pointing neck. The crucible for high-temperature reactions. Many of these devices had earlier origins, but Islamic alchemists perfected them, developed standardized designs, wrote detailed instructions for their use. When you see a chemistry lab today with its glassware and heating equipment, you're seeing the distant descendants of alchemical workshops. Substances discovered or refined by Islamic alchemists included several important acids: sulfuric acid, nitric acid, aqua regia. This last a mixture of acids capable of dissolving gold. Various salts and their properties were systematically studied. Alcohol, distilled to high purity, became both a solvent for extracting plant essences and a substance studied in its own right. The word _(9) itself comes from Arabic, from alcool, originally meaning a fine powder used as eyeliner but coming to mean any refined substance and eventually the refined spirit we now call alcohol. But alchemy wasn't just practical chemistry, It had philosophical and even spiritual dimensions. Many alchemists believed that the transformation of base metals into gold was possible, because all matter shared a fundamental unity, differed only in accidental properties that could be altered. This was wrong as physics, but it represented a kind of thinking about matter that was deeply philosophical, an attempt to understand the essential nature of substance. The alchemical quest was, in part, a quest for understanding transformation itself, how things change, what remains constant through change, what makes a substance what it is. The secretive nature of alchemical writing frustrates modern readers. Alchemists often used obscure symbols, coded language, allegories and metaphors. A substance might be called our Mercury, or the eagle, or the green lion, making it hard to know exactly what was being discussed. This obscurity was sometimes deliberate, protecting trade secrets or excluding the uninitiated, but it also reflected the difficulty of describing chemical processes without modern chemical nomenclature. How do you clearly describe a reaction when you don't have chemical formulas, when you don't know about atoms and molecules, when you're working out the very concepts needed to think clearly about chemistry? The practical applications of alchemical knowledge were significant even when transmutation failed. Metallurgy benefited from alchemical understanding of how to extract metals from ores, how to purify them, how to create alloys with desired properties. Medicine used substances prepared through alchemical methods. Perfume making and cosmetics relied on distillation and extraction techniques developed in alchemical workshops. Dyes, inks, glass making, all these crafts benefited from chemical knowledge even when that knowledge came wrapped in alchemical theory. What's important to understand is that alchemy, for all its fantastical goals, was a serious intellectual pursuit in this period. Scholars who wrote on medicine and mathematics and astronomy also wrote on alchemy. It wasn't considered separate from other sciences, but part of the larger project of understanding nature. The rigour of method, the attention to reproducible procedures, the careful record-keeping, these were consistent across sciences. An astronomer measuring planetary positions and an alchemist distilling substances shared a fundamental approach, a commitment to careful observation and systematic procedure. When alchemy eventually gave rise to modern chemistry in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the transmutation of elements was abandoned in favour of understanding chemical reactions and composition, much of the equipment, many of the procedures, and the fundamental experimental approach came from alchemical tradition. The Islamic alchemists, working in their workshops with their crucibles and alembics, searching for transformations, created the foundation on which chemistry would be built. The goal might have been wrong, but the journey toward it led somewhere real and valuable. And perhaps there's something beautiful in that. The pursuit of an impossible dream, conducted with rigour and care, can still generate real knowledge. The alchemist who never transmuted led to gold nonetheless learned things about the nature of matter, developed techniques and tools, created knowledge that would outlive his unsuccessful quest. Sometimes the journey matters more than the destination. Sometimes what you discover along the way is more valuable than what you were looking for. Let's consider what it means to move water upward, against gravity's pull. Rivers run downhill, rain falls from sky to earth, and yet civilizations need water where water doesn't naturally flow. They need it on high ground, in the centres of cities, in places far from rivers and springs. The engineers of the Islamic Golden Age solved this problem with remarkable ingenuity, creating systems that would seem impossible without understanding the principles they employed. The classical texts mentioned various water-lifting devices, water wheels, chain pumps, bucket systems. These had ancient precedents, but Islamic engineers refined them, scaled them up, and deployed them systematically across their civilization. They wrote detailed treatises explaining the principles involved, providing diagrams and instructions, systematizing the knowledge so others could replicate and improve upon their designs. Engineering became not just a craft passed down through apprenticeship, but a science recorded in books, explained through geometry and mechanics. In the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, written by Ibn al-Razaz al-Jazari in 1106, we find descriptions of 50 devices, from water clocks to automated machines to musical robots. Al-Jazari worked as an engineer in the Artukid court in what is now Turkey, and his book represents the culmination of centuries of Islamic mechanical engineering. Each device is described in detail with diagrams showing construction, materials and principles of operation. These weren't just theoretical designs. Al-Jazari built these devices, tested them, refined them, then recorded what worked. One of his most ingenious inventions was a water clock in the form of an elephant, where water dripping at a controlled rate would trigger a series of mechanical actions. A bird would whistle, a mahout would strike a cymbal, all powered by the steady flow of water and carefully designed linkages and gears. It was both timekeeper and entertainment, both functional and whimsical. The elephant clock demonstrated mastery of hydraulics, gearing, timing mechanisms, and automation. It was engineering as artistry. Al-Jazari's work with camshafts, cranks, and connecting rods predates their European use by centuries. These fundamental machine components, which would become central to the Industrial Revolution, were described and illustrated in his manuscripts. He understood how rotary motion could be converted to reciprocating motion and vice versa, how mechanical advantage could be gained through gearing, how complex automated sequences could be created through clever linkages. Irrigation systems across the Islamic world demonstrated engineering on a larger scale. Qanats, underground channels that transported water from mountain sources to valleys and cities, were perfected and spread widely. These required understanding groundwater flow, precise surveying to maintain proper gradients over distances of many miles, sophisticated construction techniques to excavate and support tunnels. Some qanats built in this period are still functioning today, testament to both the quality of construction and the soundness of design. The sakia or sakia, an animal-powered water wheel, was improved and standardized. A donkey or ox walking in circles would turn a vertical wheel geared to a horizontal wheel that lifted water from a lower level to a higher one. These became ubiquitous across agricultural regions, allowing cultivation of lands that couldn't be irrigated by simpler means. The geometry of gear ratios, the materials used for wear resistance, the optimal diameter for different lifting heights, all of this was worked out through combination of theory and trial. Large-scale construction projects demonstrated both engineering skill and organizational capacity. Bridges spanning major rivers, dams controlling water flow, city walls protecting populations, all required sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. The use of pointed arches, which distribute weight differently than round arches and can span greater distances with less material, became widespread. These weren't just architectural features, they were engineering solutions to structural problems, allowing buildings to reach greater heights and enclose larger spaces. The science of statics, understanding how forces balance in structures, was studied and applied. Scholars wrote about centers of gravity, about how weight distributes through structural members, about the strength of materials. They conducted tests to understand how different building materials behaved under load, how arches transferred forces, how to design structures that would stand for centuries. The great mosques and palaces of this period stand as proof that this knowledge was real and effective. Perhaps what's most impressive is how engineering knowledge was systematically recorded and transmitted. Engineers didn't just build things, they wrote about what they built, explaining the principles, describing the techniques, providing enough detail that readers could reproduce their work. This commitment to documentation meant that knowledge accumulated rather than being repeatedly lost and rediscovered. Each generation of engineers could build on the previous generation's work, secure in the knowledge that successful designs had been recorded and unsuccessful ones analysed for their failures. The practical impact was immense. Cities had reliable water supplies. Agriculture expanded into marginal lands. Travellers could cross rivers safely on well-built bridges. Time could be measured accurately with mechanical clocks. All of this rested on engineering knowledge, on the systematic application of geometric and mechanical principles to practical problems, and the broader impact was equally significant. The engineering treatises of the Islamic Golden Age, when translated into Latin, helped spark the Renaissance in Europe. The mechanical knowledge, the design principles, the very concept that engineering could be systematized and taught through books, all of this flowed westward, helping to make possible the technological transformations that would follow. Imagine a library containing 400,000 books, or some accounts say 600,000. Or others claim 4 million, though that seems impossibly high. The exact number doesn't matter as much as what it represents. This was the Library of Cordoba in Islamic Spain, and it was just one among many great libraries across the Islamic world. These weren't just book repositories, they were centres of learning, nodes in a vast network of knowledge transmission, physical embodiments of the value placed on learning and scholarship. Creating a library in the medieval world was far more difficult than we might imagine. Every book had to be copied by hand, a laborious process requiring skilled scribes, expensive materials, and enormous time. A major work might take months to copy. An error by a tired scribe could corrupt the text, introducing mistakes that would propagate through subsequent copies. Quality control was essential, requiring scholars who could compare copies, check for errors, maintain textual accuracy across generations of reproduction. The Islamic world developed sophisticated systems for book production. Scriptoria employed multiple scribes working under supervision. Proofreaders checked copies against authoritative originals. Marginalia indicated disputed readings or variant versions. Colophons at the end of manuscripts recorded the scribe's name, the date and place of copying, sometimes the name of the patron who commissioned the work. This created a kind of textual lineage, a documented chain of transmission that helped ensure reliability. The paper-making technology that spread from China to the Islamic world in the 8th century revolutionized book production. Paper was cheaper than parchment, easier to produce, more practical for large libraries. The first paper mills in the Islamic world appeared in Samarkand, then spread to Baghdad, Cairo, Morocco, and eventually Spain. This made books more accessible, allowed libraries to grow larger, enabled scholarship to expand. The connection between technology and intellectual life was direct and profound. Libraries developed sophisticated classification systems to organize their collections. Books were categorized by subject, and within subjects by various principles. Some libraries arranged books geographically by the author's origin. Others used topical divisions that reflected the Islamic system of knowledge, with religious sciences in one section, rational sciences in another, literary and linguistic works in a third. Card catalogues, or their manuscript equivalent, allowed scholars to locate specific works without browsing through thousands of volumes. The social function of libraries extended beyond book storage. Many included reading rooms where scholars could work. Some employed librarians who weren't just custodians but scholars themselves, able to guide readers to relevant texts, to suggest connections between works, to facilitate research. Libraries became meeting places for intellectual communities, where scholars in different fields could encounter each other, where conversations could spark new ideas, where the synthesis of knowledge from different domains could occur naturally. Access policies varied. Some libraries were essentially private, owned by rulers or wealthy families, though they might grant access to favoured scholars. Others were attached to mosques or madrasas and served educational functions, open to students and teachers. Some were public, in the sense that any serious scholar could gain access regardless of background or affiliation. This openness, this recognition that knowledge should be available to those capable of using it, was notable for the era. Book culture extended beyond libraries. There were book markets where manuscripts could be bought and sold, creating a commercial trade in knowledge. Bibliophiles collected books, sometimes amassing private libraries rivaling public ones. authors could achieve fame and financial reward through their writings. The Caliph Al-Hakam II of Cordoba reportedly had agents in Damascus and Cairo, buying books for his library, paying high prices for rare works, commissioning copies of texts not yet available in Spain. Books were valuable, culturally and sometimes financially. The variety of texts collected in these libraries is striking. Religious works certainly, commentaries on the Quran, and compilations of hadith. But also Greek philosophy and science, Indian mathematics, Persian literature and history, medical texts, astronomical tables, mathematical treatises, poetry and grammar and rhetoric, historical chronicles and geographical descriptions. Libraries preserved not just one tradition but many, not just Islamic knowledge, but human knowledge in its diversity. When we think about knowledge transmission in this era, we tend to focus on famous scholars and their discoveries, but the infrastructure that made their work possible deserves attention too. The scribes who copied texts accurately, the patrons who funded libraries, the systems that organised and preserved knowledge, the book culture that made scholarship a valued activity. Without this infrastructure, individual brilliance might produce insights, but those insights would die with their creators, would have to be rediscovered by each generation. The catastrophic destruction of libraries, when Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258, when Cordoba's library was destroyed after the Christian reconquest, represents more than the loss of buildings or even books. It represents the disruption of knowledge transmission, the severing of connections between past and future. Some knowledge was lost completely, surviving only in references and quotations in other works. Some was preserved because copies existed elsewhere, demonstrating the importance of redundancy, of distributed knowledge storage. But many works did survive, copied and recopied across centuries, preserved in libraries from Morocco to Central Asia, eventually translated into Latin and other languages, carrying knowledge across time and culture and language. Every time we read a Greek philosophical text, we're often reading a work that survived the Middle Ages because it was preserved in Arabic translation when the Greek original was lost. Every time we use mathematical or astronomical knowledge developed in the Islamic Golden Age, we're benefiting from the library culture that preserved and transmitted that knowledge. The books themselves were physical objects, fragile and vulnerable. But the knowledge in them, when properly copied and distributed and preserved, proved remarkably resilient. Picture a caravan crossing the desert, camels loaded with silk and spices, merchants calculating profits in their heads, guards watching for bandits, guides reading the landscape and stars. This caravan carries goods certainly traded from market to market across thousands of miles, but it also carries ideas. The merchant who trades in Damascus this year might carry mathematical techniques learned there to Samarkand next year. The scholar travelling with the caravan for safety might discuss philosophy with fellow travellers during long desert evenings. Knowledge travelled the same routes that goods did, and the Islamic world's position at the centre of medieval trade networks made it a nexus for cultural exchange. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, but a network of routes connecting China with the Mediterranean, passing through Central Asia, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula. Other routes connected the Islamic world with sub-Saharan Africa, bringing gold and slaves northward, carrying salt and manufactured goods southward. Maritime routes linked the Persian Gulf and Red Sea with India, Southeast Asia, and East Africa, creating a vast Indian Ocean trading network. The Islamic world wasn't isolated but deeply connected to Eurasia and Africa through commercial exchange. These trade networks had existed before Islam, of course, but Islamic civilization's expansion and the relative stability it created in many regions facilitated trade. The use of Arabic as a lingua franca across a vast region simplified commercial communication. Islamic commercial law provided frameworks for contracts, partnerships, and dispute resolution that worked across cultural boundaries. Banking and credit systems, including the use of bills of exchange that allowed merchants to access funds in distant cities without carrying gold, made large-scale commerce more practical. Ideas about technology transferred along these routes. Papermaking spread from China to Samarkand to Baghdad. Numbering systems moved from India to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. Agricultural crops and cultivation techniques crossed vast distances. Rice from Asia, citrus from China, sugarcane from India, cotton, eggplants, artichokes, all spread across Islamic lands and sometimes beyond. This biological exchange, alongside the more celebrated Columbian exchange of later centuries, transformed agriculture and diet across regions. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge from India profoundly influenced Islamic science. The concept of zero as a number, the decimal place value system, trigonometric functions, all had Indian origins or were significantly developed there before being adopted and adapted by Islamic scholars. The exchange wasn't one way. Islamic astronomical tables were used in India, Islamic medical texts were translated into Sanskrit. Knowledge flowed in multiple directions along the trade routes. The translation movement we discussed earlier was, in a sense, an organized form of cultural exchange. Greek knowledge had to be sought out, manuscripts located in Byzantine lands, translators found who knew both Greek and Arabic. This required diplomatic contact, commercial relationships, personal connections between scholars in different lands. The knowledge didn't just appear magically in Baghdad. It was actively gathered, often through networks that depended on trade and travel. Cultural exchange could be fraught. Different societies had different values, different religious traditions, different assumptions about what was true or important. But the practical needs of trade created spaces where these differences could be negotiated. A Muslim merchant and a Hindu merchant might disagree profoundly about theology, but they could agree on the terms of a contract, on fair weights and measures, on the value of goods. This pragmatic tolerance, this ability to find common ground for specific purposes while maintaining different broader commitments, characterized much cross-cultural interaction in this period. Travellers' accounts provide windows into this world of exchange. Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab traveller, wrote detailed descriptions of the Volga Bulgars and the Rus he encountered on a diplomatic mission, recording customs and beliefs quite foreign to his own with careful observation if not always approval. Ibn Battuta, in the 14th century, travelled from Morocco to China, recording encounters with different cultures across the Islamic world and beyond. These accounts were more than curiosities. They were data points, information about the wider world that scholars could use, compare, try to understand systematically. Geographical knowledge advanced through this travel and trade. Maps became more accurate as travellers provided better information about distances and routes. Descriptions of foreign lands became more detailed and reliable. The understanding that the world was spherical and of roughly what size was maintained and refined through astronomical observation and geographical calculation. When European explorers later ventured into the Indian Ocean, they found maritime routes already established, cities already trading, navigation already sophisticated, a system in which Islamic merchants and sailors were central participants. What we see in all this is that knowledge, like goods, circulates. It doesn't develop in isolation, but through contact and exchange, through borrowing and adapting and synthesizing. The Islamic Golden Age flourished partly because Islamic civilization was positioned at the hub of medieval trade networks, able to draw on knowledge from Greece and India and China, able to synthesize diverse traditions. The openness to learning from others, the willingness to adopt useful ideas regardless of their origin, was as important to intellectual advancement as any individual genius. This has implications for how we think about knowledge and culture. There's no such thing as purely original thought, created ex nihilo without influence. All knowledge builds on what came before, draws from multiple sources, combines influences in new ways. The Islamic scholars who translated Greek philosophy and adapted Indian mathematics weren't derivative or unoriginal. They were doing what all intellectual traditions do, taking what's valuable from available sources and building something new. The question isn't whether you borrowed ideas, but what you did with them, how you transformed and extended them. And perhaps there's comfort in that looking back. Human knowledge is a collective project, built by many hands across many centuries, crossing boundaries of culture and language and religion. No single tradition owns it. It belongs to all of us, or rather, we all belong to it, contributing our small part to something vast and ongoing. The scholars of the Islamic Golden Age understood this, and in their openness to knowledge from anywhere, in their willingness to learn from whoever had wisdom to share, they modelled an attitude that's still valuable today. Medicine in the Islamic Golden Age was never just about bodies. It was about the whole person, mind and soul, as well as flesh and bone, and the best physicians understood that healing required attending to all dimensions of human existence. This holistic view, this refusal to separate physical from psychological from spiritual, characterized medical theory and practice in ways that seem remarkably modern, even as they're grounded in pre-modern frameworks. The hospital, as an institution designed specifically for treating the sick, reached new levels of sophistication in this period. The first hospital in the Islamic world was built in Baghdad in the late 8th century, and over the following centuries, hospitals spread across Islamic lands. These weren't just places where sick people were housed. They were teaching institutions, research centres, and places where medical knowledge was systematically applied and advanced. A well-equipped hospital might have separate wards for different types of illness, one for fevers, one for eye diseases, one for surgical cases, one for mental illness. This separation recognised both that different conditions required different treatments, and that some diseases were contagious. Hospitals employed doctors, surgeons, pharmacists, nurses, and support staff. Some had libraries where physicians could consult medical texts. Some had kitchens preparing specific diets for different conditions. The most advanced had lecture halls where medical students learned by observing experienced physicians treating patients. The teaching hospital model, where medical education happened partly through clinical observation and practice, rather than just reading texts, was well developed. Students would accompany senior physicians on rounds, observing examinations and treatments, learning to recognize diseases by their symptoms, understanding how to take case histories and make diagnoses. This hands-on education, combining book learning with practical experience, produced physicians who understood medicine as both science and art. Medical ethics received serious attention. Physicians wrote about their obligations to patients, their duty to treat regardless of ability to pay, the importance of honesty about prognosis. The Hippocratic tradition, transmitted through Arabic translations and commentaries, provided one ethical framework. Islamic religious principles provided another, emphasizing charity, care for the vulnerable, honesty, and humility. These traditions reinforced each other, creating a strong sense that medicine was a sacred trust, not just a way to make a living. The treatment of mental illness shows the period's sophisticated approach. Rather than seeing mental illness as demonic possession or moral failing, physicians recognized it as illness deserving of treatment. Hospitals had psychiatric wards where patients were treated with a combination of medication, music therapy, occupational therapy, and what we might call talk therapy. The goal was to create a calm environment where healing could occur, addressing both the symptoms and what we'd now call the patient's quality of life. Pharmacy developed as a profession separate from but complementary to medicine. Pharmacists weren't just merchants selling drugs, but trained professionals who prepared medications according to precise formulas, who understood the properties of medicinal substances, who could advise on proper dosages and administration. Pharmacopoeias, books listing medicinal substances and their uses, were compiled and standardized. Quality control included inspectors who checked pharmacies to ensure they maintained proper standards and didn't sell adulterated or expired medications. The integration of different medical traditions characterized Islamic medicine. Greek medicine, Particularly Galenic theory, with its emphasis on humours and temperaments, provided the basic framework. But Indian medical knowledge, Persian medical traditions, and empirical observations from Islamic physicians themselves all contributed. The best physicians weren't dogmatic about any single tradition, but used whatever worked, whatever clinical experience showed to be effective. This empirical flexibility, this willingness to learn from any source, made Islamic medicine more effective than it might have been if rigidly confined to one tradition. Surgical techniques advanced significantly. Physicians wrote surgical texts describing operations for cataracts, kidney stones, dental problems, and various injuries. They described instruments needed for different procedures, techniques for minimizing pain and blood loss, care needed to prevent infection. Some of these procedures remained standard practice for centuries. The use of catgut for internal sutures, the cauterization of wounds to stop bleeding, the understanding that surgical instruments should be clean, all of these were well established. Women physicians, while less common than men, existed and sometimes gained considerable reputation for their skill. Some hospitals had separate sections for female patients, treated by female physicians. The historical record is incomplete here, as it often is regarding women's participation in various fields, but what survives suggests that medical knowledge was available to women who sought it, and that skilled female physicians were valued for their expertise. Public health measures showed sophisticated understanding of disease prevention. Cities had regulations regarding water purity, waste disposal, food safety. Markets were inspected to ensure food was fresh and properly prepared. During epidemics, quarantine measures might be imposed, based on the observation that separating the sick from the healthy could slow disease spread. These measures weren't always effective. Medical knowledge had real limits, but they represented systematic attempts to protect public health through collective action. Looking back across the centuries, what stands out is how seriously Islamic civilization took the project of healing. Hospitals were funded from charitable endowments, ensuring they could treat the poor alongside the wealthy. Medical education was systematized and transmitted across generations. Medical knowledge was recorded in detailed texts that could be studied by future physicians. The care of the sick was understood not just as individual charity but as collective obligation, a sign of a civilized society. That commitment to healing, that recognition that medicine serves human dignity, is part of the enduring legacy of Islamic medical practice. Let's imagine ourselves into a scholar's life, walking through a day in 9th century Baghdad at the height of the Abbasid period. The city wakes early, and so does our scholar, rising before dawn for morning prayers. The pre-dawn darkness is already showing hints of light to the east, and from minarets across the city, the call to prayer rises, layered voices calling the faithful to worship. Our scholar performs ablutions, prays, then sits for a few moments in the quiet before the household fully wakes. Breakfast is simple: dates, bread, perhaps some cheese, water. In wealthier households there might be milk or fruit juice. The scholar eats while reviewing notes from the previous day's work, preparing mentally for what today will bring. There are manuscripts to read, texts to copy, problems to solve. Perhaps there's a student coming for lessons. Perhaps a colleague wants to discuss a difficult passage in Aristotle. The day already has shape and purpose. As the sun rises, the household comes fully alive. Servants move about their tasks. Children's voices rise in the courtyard. The scholar retreats to a study, a room set aside for intellectual work. This room holds treasures, manuscripts carefully copied or purchased at considerable expense, writing materials, paper, ink, pens made from reeds, sharpened just so. Perhaps an astrolabe hanging on the wall, both tool and beautiful object. Reference books arranged on shelves or in chests. This is the scholar's workspace. The environment carefully arranged to support concentrated thought. The morning hours are precious for serious work. The mind is fresh, the house relatively quiet. Our scholar might be working on a commentary on a Greek philosophical text, comparing different Arabic translations, considering how to explain a difficult concept, perhaps disagreeing with previous commentators and explaining why. This work requires intense concentration. Each word matters. The goal is clarity without sacrificing precision, accessibility without oversimplification. After several hours of this demanding work, the scholar's eyes are tired from reading closely written manuscripts, and it's time for a break. Midday brings the second prayer and the main meal. The household gathers, though if the scholar is wealthy enough to keep separate quarters for family and guests, meals might be taken with other scholars and students. The conversation ranges widely. Current events, recent books arriving from Damascus or Cairo, philosophical questions, maybe some poetry recited from memory. Food is important, but so is conversation. The meal is a social and intellectual occasion, not just refueling. Afternoon might bring teaching responsibilities. Students arrive, perhaps individually, perhaps in small groups. The teaching isn't lectures in the modern sense, but something more interactive. The teacher reads from a text, explains difficult passages, asks questions to check understanding, debates points with advanced students. The students take notes, ask for clarification, sometimes disagree respectfully with interpretations. Learning is active, engaged, demanding for both teacher and student. Or the afternoon might be spent in the library of the House of Wisdom or another institutional collection. Our scholar needs to consult a text not in the personal library, wants to compare different manuscripts of the same work, or simply enjoys the atmosphere of the library, the presence of other scholars similarly engaged. Libraries in this period aren't silent spaces. Scholars discuss texts in low voices, debate interpretations, share discoveries. The library is a workspace and a community space. As afternoon moves toward evening, there might be time for a walk. Baghdad is a great city, bustling and diverse. Markets sell goods from across the known world. Craftsmen work in open shops, their skills on display. The river flows constant through the city, boats passing up and down. Walking through the city provides not just exercise, but stimulation, exposure to the variety of human activity. A scholar's life is contemplative, but needn't be isolated from the world's richness. The fourth prayer comes as the sun sets, marking the transition to evening. Dinner is lighter than the midday meal. Perhaps this evening there's a gathering of scholars, a regular meeting where people share their work, discuss recent developments, argue about disputed points. These gatherings are informal but intellectually rigorous. Reputation is made partly through such discussions, through demonstrating knowledge, through making clever arguments, through showing respect for others while defending one's own positions. Or perhaps the evening is quieter, spent at home with family. Children might ask questions about what their father studies. A scholar might share some simpler version of the day's intellectual work, finding ways to make complex ideas accessible. Teaching the next generation not specific content so much as an approach to learning, a sense that knowledge is valuable and worth pursuing. Not every scholar's child will become a scholar, but all grow up in households where learning is valued, where books are treasured, where questions are encouraged. Before bed, one final prayer, a few moments reviewing what was accomplished today and planning tomorrow. Perhaps some light reading, something pleasurable rather than demanding, poetry, history, a well-written travel account. Then sleep, knowing tomorrow will bring more manuscripts to read, more problems to solve, more conversations with colleagues, more teaching, more of the life to which the scholar has devoted himself. It's a good life, one of purpose and meaning, of contributing to something larger than individual existence, the collective human project of understanding our world and our place in it. Not every day goes this smoothly, of course. There are frustrations, setbacks, days when work goes poorly. But this is the pattern, the rhythm of a scholar's life, repeated day after day, year after year, contributing to the remarkable intellectual flourishing of the age. There's something almost sacred about an observatory, a place built specifically for watching the heavens, for measuring the movements of celestial bodies with utmost precision, for discerning patterns in the apparent chaos of the night sky. The great observatories of the Islamic Golden Age were such places, combining architectural beauty with scientific function, devotion with empiricism, wonder with measurement. Let's visit a few of them, understanding what they achieved and what they represented. The Marageh Observatory, established in northwestern Iran in 1259, came late in our period, but represented the culmination of centuries of Islamic astronomical work. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the greatest astronomers and mathematicians of the era, convinced the Mongol ruler Hulagu Khan to fund its construction. The irony wasn't lost on contemporaries. Hulagu had recently conquered Baghdad, destroying much of that city including its libraries, yet here he was funding the most advanced astronomical research facility in the world. The Marageh Observatory wasn't just a building with instruments, it was an institution with a library of 400,000 volumes, many rescued from Baghdad and other cities the Mongols conquered, a staff of astronomers from across the Islamic world and beyond, even including astronomers from China. It had instruments built to unprecedented size and precision. Larger instruments could measure smaller angles more accurately. So astronomical instruments were built as large as engineering allowed. Some were permanently mounted in buildings constructed to specific orientations. Others were portable, but still substantial, requiring multiple people to operate. The work done at Marageh was systematic and collaborative. Astronomers observed planetary positions night after night over years, creating records of unprecedented detail and accuracy. They checked their observations against earlier records, looking for discrepancies that might indicate errors in the models used to predict planetary positions, and they found problems with Ptolemy's models, cases where predictions didn't match observations, where the mathematics seemed forced rather than natural. Al-Tusi developed alternative models for planetary motion, using combinations of circular motions to produce the same predictions as Ptolemy, but in mathematically more elegant ways. His quote 13, a clever geometric construction, showing how two circular motions could produce rectilinear motion, was a technical innovation that later influenced European astronomy. Some historians have suggested that Copernicus knew of Al-Tusi's work, that there might have been some connection between Islamic astronomical models and the heliocentric revolution in Europe. Whether there was direct transmission or independent discovery remains debated, but the similarities are striking. The Samarkand Observatory, built by Ulugh Beg in the 15th century, continued this tradition. Ulugh Beg was himself a capable astronomer and mathematician, unusual for a ruler, and he gathered some of the best astronomers of his time to Samarkand. The observatory's most famous instrument was a massive sextant built into the ground, with a radius of 40 meters, allowing extraordinarily precise measurements of the sun's meridian altitude. This was engineering as much as astronomy, requiring precise surveying, careful construction, understanding of how to make measurements accurate. The astronomical tables produced at Samarkand, based on new observations and calculations, were the most accurate of the medieval period. They gave positions of stars and planets, tables for predicting eclipses, data on the length of the year and the precession of the equinoxes. These weren't just theoretical exercises. Accurate astronomical tables had practical uses in determining prayer times, calculating the Islamic calendar, navigation, and astrology. But the primary motivation seems to have been simpler and deeper: the desire to understand the heavens, to map the celestial sphere accurately, to know the cosmos in which we live. What's moving about these observatories is the sheer ambition and dedication they represent. Astronomical observation is patient work. You can't rush the planets through their orbits. You have to wait, night after night, measuring positions, recording data, building up a picture over years and decades. The observations might not be useful to the observer personally. They're contributions to a collective project that will outlive any individual. You observe and record so that future astronomers will have better data, so that understanding can advance, so that the long project of comprehending the cosmos can continue. The instruments themselves were beautiful in their precision. An astrolabe was a scientific instrument, but also a work of art, engraved with intricate detail, balanced perfectly, functioning as it should while being aesthetically pleasing. A large observatory instrument might be made of brass and iron, precisely calibrated, with sighting mechanisms allowing measurements to fractions of a degree. The craftsmanship required was extraordinary. The people who made these instruments weren't just artisans. They were solving engineering problems, understanding mechanics and materials, creating tools that pushed the boundaries of what was measurable. Observational astronomy also required mathematics. Raw observations were just numbers until they were analysed, compared to models used to calculate tables or test theories. The astronomers at Maragay and Samarkand were as much mathematicians as observers, working with spherical trigonometry, geometric models, numerical calculations. They developed new mathematical techniques to solve astronomical problems, and their mathematical innovations often had applications beyond astronomy. When we look up at the night sky now, we see what those Islamic astronomers saw, the same stars and planets, though from different positions and times. The constellations they named are sometimes still used. The observations they recorded can still be consulted for historical data on celestial phenomena. The methods they developed for accurate measurement influenced how science approaches precision. But perhaps most of all, we inherit from them the sense that the heavens are knowable, that patient observation and careful calculation can reveal the patterns in apparent chaos, that the cosmos, for all its vastness, is not beyond human understanding. That confidence, that faith in the power of systematic inquiry, is one of their most important gifts to us. Hold the idea of a manuscript in your mind for a moment. Not a printed book, mass-produced and identical to thousands of others. A manuscript, handwritten, unique even when it's a copy of another text, carrying the marks of the person who wrote it, the place where it was made, the journey it took through the centuries. Each manuscript that survives from the Islamic Golden Age is a miracle of preservation, a text that survived wars and fires, neglect and decay, the simple passage of time that erodes all things physical. The materials themselves were vulnerable. Paper, though cheaper and more practical than parchment, is fragile. It tears, burns, rots in dampness, fades in light. Ink can fade or corrode the paper it's written on. Bindings deteriorate, pages come loose, margins crumble. Without care, a manuscript might last a century. With care, it might last several centuries. That any manuscript survived 1,000 years or more is remarkable, testament to how they were valued and preserved. The process of making a manuscript was laborious. A scribe would prepare the pages, ruling lines to keep the text straight, marking margins. Then came the careful work of copying, usually from another manuscript. This required literacy in the language, knowledge of the script, familiarity with the subject matter. A scribe copying a mathematical text needed to understand the mathematics well enough to recognize when something didn't make sense, might indicate an error in the exemplar being copied from. Medical texts required medical knowledge. Philosophical texts, philosophical understanding. Errors inevitably crept in. A tired scribe might skip a line, repeat a line, misread a word. The next copyist might introduce different errors. Over generations of copying, texts could become corrupted, diverging from the original in numerous small ways. This is why textual scholarship became important. Scholars would compare different manuscripts of the same text, trying to establish which readings were likely original, creating critical editions that represented the best approximation of what the author actually wrote. Some manuscripts are beautiful beyond their textual content. Illuminated manuscripts with decorated margins, elaborate title pages, diagrams drawn with geometric precision, and coloured with mineral and vegetable dyes. The act of copying a text could be devotional, a way of honouring the knowledge the text contained. Scribes often included colophons, notes at the end of their work, sometimes just recording the date and place of copying, sometimes expressing gratitude to God for helping them complete the work, sometimes asking readers to pray for them. Libraries and wealthy patrons played crucial roles in manuscript preservation. A well-funded library would employ scribes to copy deteriorating manuscripts before they became unreadable. Multiple copies of important works would be made and distributed, ensuring that if one copy was lost, others survived. This redundancy was essential. No single library was safe from fire or conquest, or simple institutional decay. But if copies existed in Cairo and Baghdad and Cordoba and Samarkand, at least some were likely to survive whatever local disaster might occur. The Mongol conquest of Baghdad in 1258 destroyed vast numbers of manuscripts. Stories tell of the Tigris running black with ink from manuscripts thrown into the river, though this is probably exaggeration. But the destruction was real and catastrophic. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, original copies of works, rare texts existing in only a few copies, entire libraries, were lost. Some works survived only because copies existed elsewhere. Others were lost completely, known only from references in surviving texts. Similarly, the Christian reconquest of Spain led to manuscript losses. Some Arabic manuscripts were destroyed deliberately as symbols of Islamic culture. Others were simply neglected, their content inaccessible to new rulers who didn't read Arabic. But some were preserved, recognized as valuable even by people who couldn't read them, eventually transported to European libraries or translated into Latin before the originals were lost. The manuscripts that did survive often have complex histories. A manuscript might be copied in Baghdad in the 10th century, travel to Spain in the 11th, be taken to Morocco in the 13th during the Christian reconquest, make its way to Cairo in the 14th century, eventually be purchased by a European collector in the 19th century, and now reside in a library in Paris or London or Istanbul. Each stage of this journey involved someone deciding the manuscript was worth preserving, worth protecting, worth carrying to safety. These weren't always deliberate decisions about preserving cultural heritage. Sometimes it was just someone who thought the book might be valuable or useful or interesting. The work of modern manuscript scholars involves detective work. They examine paper and ink to determine when and where a manuscript was likely made. They analyse handwriting to identify scribes. They trace provenance, the chain of ownership, through ownership marks, marginal notes. Library stamps. They compare different manuscripts of the same text to establish relationships, figuring out which was copied from which, constructing family trees of manuscripts. This work allows us to understand not just the text but its history, how it travelled, who read it, how it was valued. Digital humanities projects are now photographing and cataloguing manuscripts from across the Islamic world, making them accessible to scholars worldwide. A researcher in New York can examine a manuscript held in Damascus or Tashkent without travelling there, can compare it to manuscripts in other collections, can collaborate with colleagues anywhere. This democratization of access means that more people can study these materials, that knowledge about the Islamic Golden Age can advance more rapidly. But there's still something to be said for the physical encounter with a manuscript. For sitting in a rare books library with a text written 1,000 years ago, seeing the handwriting, the variations in ink colour, the places where the scribe corrected an error or made a marginal note. These are physical objects created by individual human beings, not abstract texts, but concrete artifacts. They connect us directly to the people who made them across vast gulfs of time and culture. That connection, that sense of touching something ancient and precious, is part of why manuscripts matter beyond their textual content. Every manuscript that survives is a text that didn't get lost, a story that continued to be told, knowledge that wasn't forgotten. In that survival, in that preservation across centuries of historical upheaval and change, there's something hopeful. Human knowledge, when valued and cared for, can persist. The manuscripts of the Islamic Golden Age carefully copied and preserved and translated and studied, carried knowledge from one age to another, from one civilization to another, ensuring that what was learned wouldn't be lost. That effort, that care, deserves our gratitude and our continued commitment to preservation. The historical record of women's intellectual participation in the Islamic Golden Age is frustratingly incomplete. Medieval chroniclers, almost always men, tended to record men's achievements while mentioning women only in exceptional cases or when they intersected with male-dominated institutions. Library catalogues recorded authors' names, usually men. Biographical dictionaries focus primarily on male scholars. The result is a picture that likely underrepresents women's actual participation in intellectual life, leaving us to piece together what we can from scattered references and the occasional fuller account. But what we can piece together suggests that women's participation, while limited by social constraints that varied across regions and periods, did exist. Women could be educated, could study with scholars, could even teach and transmit knowledge. The form this took varied significantly depending on social class, family circumstances, and historical period. A woman from a wealthy, educated family might have access to private tutoring, to family libraries, to intellectual conversations in the household. A woman from a more modest background would have fewer opportunities, but might still achieve education if circumstances and personal determination aligned. One of the clearest areas of women's participation was in the transmission of hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Islamic tradition placed high value on chains of transmission, knowing who taught whom, being able to trace knowledge back to authoritative sources. Women could be crucial links in these chains. Some women were recognized as particularly reliable transmitters of hadith, sought out by male scholars who wanted to study with them to gain access to traditions they preserved. This gave educated women a recognized role in Islamic scholarship, one that was religiously significant. Fatima al-Fihri, in the 9th century in Fez, Morocco, founded what became the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, one of the oldest continuously operating educational institutions in the world. She inherited wealth from her father and used it to establish a mosque and associated school. While the details are debated and the institution evolved over centuries, the fact that a woman could found such an institution, that her role was remembered and honoured, suggests that women's patronage of learning was recognised and valued. Women could also pursue certain kinds of intellectual work within household contexts. Medical knowledge was often transmitted within families, with daughters learning from mothers or fathers. A woman might become skilled in preparing medications, in diagnosing certain conditions, in providing medical care within her community. This knowledge was practical and valuable, even if it wasn't always recorded in formal medical texts or recognized in official institutions. Some women from elite families received substantial education. Walada bint al-Mustaqfi, an 11th century Cordoban princess and poet, was educated in literature and poetry, held literary salons in her palace, engaged in intellectual and romantic relationships with male poets. Her poetry survives, marked by wit, independence, sometimes by frank expression of desire that must have seemed shocking in her conservative context. She represents the possibilities available to elite women even as she was exceptional rather than typical. The scholar Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, writing in the 15th century, mentioned studying with approximately 53 female teachers during his education. This suggests that women teachers, while less common than male teachers, were present in sufficient numbers that a serious student might encounter many of them. These women were transmitting knowledge, maintaining scholarly chains, participating in the educational system in ways that were recognized and valued by male scholars seeking comprehensive education. What moves me, thinking about this, is imagining the women who loved learning but had limited opportunity to pursue it. The daughter who watched her brother go off to study with famous scholars while she remained home. The widow who, freed from some social constraints after her husband's death, finally could pursue the learning she'd always wanted. The woman who taught her daughters everything she knew, hoping they'd have more opportunities than she did. These stories are mostly lost to us, but they were real as the better documented stories of male scholars. The legacy is mixed. Yes, some women participated in intellectual life, and their participation was sometimes recognized and valued. But the constraints were real, the opportunities limited. And countless women's potential went unrealized because of social structures that denied them access to education and institutions. Acknowledging both the achievements that did occur and the lost possibilities that didn't seems the most honest approach to this aspect of the Golden Age's history. Imagine a manuscript making a long journey. Written in Baghdad in the 10th century, copied in Damascus in the 11th, carried to Cordoba in the 12th, translated into Latin in Toledo in the 13th, studied in Paris in the 14th, printed in Venice in the 15th. This journey, or ones like it, happened to many texts, and in that movement across space and time and language, knowledge was transmitted from Islamic civilization to European civilization, helping to transform European thought and eventually contributing to the rise of modern science. The 12th and 13th centuries were crucial for this transmission. Christian Europe was emerging from what's sometimes called the Dark Ages, though modern historians dislike that term as oversimplifying a complex period. European scholars were hungry for knowledge, aware that much of Greek learning had been lost in the West but preserved and extended in the Islamic world. They began systematically seeking out and translating Arabic texts, creating a massive transfer of knowledge. Toledo, newly conquered by Christian forces, became a major translation centre. The city had a large population of Mozarabs, Christians who had lived under Islamic rule and knew Arabic, and Jews who similarly moved between cultures and languages. These people could serve as translators, or more commonly as intermediaries in a two-step translation process from Arabic to Romance to Latin. The translators weren't always skilled, and many translations were rough, overly literal, difficult to understand. But they made knowledge available, and European scholars eagerly studied them despite their flaws. What was translated reveals what Europeans valued or needed. Scientific and medical texts were priorities. Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra, Ibn al-Haytham's Optics, Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, astronomical treatises and tables. These provided knowledge that simply didn't exist in Latin tradition. Mathematical techniques more powerful than what Europeans had. Medical knowledge more systematic and comprehensive. Astronomical observations more precise. Europeans weren't just recovering lost Greek knowledge, they were accessing Islamic additions, extensions and innovations to that knowledge. Philosophical texts were equally important. Aristotle's works, largely lost in Western Europe, were available in Arabic translation, often with Islamic commentaries that explained and interpreted the Greek master. When Aristotle returned to Europe, he came via Arabic, carrying with him the philosophical questions and approaches that Islamic thinkers had developed. The medieval European engagement with Aristotle was profoundly shaped by Islamic philosophy, by the questions Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd had asked, the solutions they'd proposed, the problems they'd identified. This created interesting dynamics. Christian scholars in Europe were reading Islamic commentaries on Greek pagan philosophy, trying to reconcile all of this with Christian theology. Sometimes they adopted Islamic solutions to philosophical problems. Sometimes they rejected them, but still benefited from having serious engagement with different perspectives. The philosophical controversies in 13th century European universities about the eternity of the world, about God's knowledge of particulars, about the relationship between reason and revelation, were shaped by questions Islamic philosophers had already grappled with. The process of translation and absorption took time. A text translated in 1200 might not be widely studied until 1250. Its implications might not be fully worked out until 1300. There were false starts, misunderstandings, controversies about whether this knowledge was compatible with Christian faith. Some texts were condemned by church authorities, others were eagerly adopted. Gradually, over the 12th through 14th centuries, European intellectual culture absorbed and built upon Islamic learning. The impact on specific fields was profound. European mathematics was transformed by the adoption of Arabic numerals and algebraic methods. Astronomy became more sophisticated with access to Islamic observations and models. Medicine was revolutionized by the availability of systematic medical encyclopedias. Navigation improved with better astronomical knowledge and instruments like the astrolabe. The development of universities in Europe during this period was partly driven by the need to master and teach this new knowledge. But knowledge didn't flow in only one direction, and the transmission wasn't just passive reception. Europeans didn't merely copy Islamic science. They engaged with it critically, tested it, sometimes modified or rejected parts of it. They brought their own traditions and questions to the material. The result was synthesis, something that was neither purely Islamic nor purely European, but a combination, a new intellectual tradition building on both foundations. The printing press, invented in Europe in the mid-15th century, accelerated this process enormously. Manuscripts were rare and expensive. A library might own a few dozen, or if very wealthy, a few hundred books. But printed books could be produced in hundreds or thousands of copies. Knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate and preserve could now be disseminated widely in years or decades. Important texts were printed and reprinted. Students could own personal copies rather than sharing scarce manuscripts. The democratization of knowledge access was revolutionary. By the 16th century, European science was beginning to move beyond its Islamic sources. Copernicus developed heliocentric astronomy. Vesalius reformed anatomy through direct observation of human bodies. European explorers were charting the globe. The scientific revolution of the 17th century would take European science in new directions, asking new questions, developing new methods, making discoveries that Islamic science hadn't anticipated. But this revolution built on foundations that included Islamic contributions. The astronomical observations, the mathematical techniques, the experimental methods, the very confidence that nature could be understood rationally, all of these had roots partly in Islamic science. Scholars debate how much to credit Islamic influence on the European scientific revolution. Some emphasize discontinuities, arguing that European science represented a break with medieval traditions, Islamic or otherwise. Others stress continuities, showing how European scientists built on earlier Islamic work even when they moved beyond it. The truth is probably complex, varying by field and individual. But what's clear is that European science didn't develop in isolation, that it benefited enormously from knowledge that had been preserved, extended and transmitted by Islamic civilization. This transmission of knowledge across civilizations offers a model and a hope. Human knowledge isn't the property of any single culture or civilization. It's a collective human achievement, built by many hands across many centuries. The same knowledge can be preserved by one civilization and advanced by another. When one civilization declines, others can preserve and build upon what it achieved. There's a kind of immortality in ideas, a way that human insight can outlive the society that produced it, finding new homes, contributing to new traditions, continuing to enrich human understanding across vast gulfs of time and culture. Let's take a moment to contemplate both the remarkable achievements of Islamic Golden Age science and its inherent limitations, to appreciate what was accomplished while acknowledging what couldn't be known with the tools and concepts available. This isn't to diminish the achievements, but to understand them in context, to recognize that all science works within the bounds of its time and place. They knew the Earth was round. This wasn't controversial or doubted in educated circles. Greek astronomers had demonstrated it centuries earlier, and Islamic scholars accepted and built upon this knowledge. They could calculate the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using astronomical observations and geometry. They understood latitude and longitude, could map the known world, could calculate distances between cities. This knowledge was practical, used in navigation, in determining the direction to Mecca, in understanding time zones. But they didn't know the Earth moved around the Sun. To them, as to ancient and medieval astronomers generally, the Earth seemed obviously stationary. We don't feel the Earth moving. Objects dropped fall straight down, not trailing behind the Earth's rotation. The heliocentric model would have seemed to contradict simple observation, to require accepting something invisible and counterintuitive. The geocentric model explained the phenomena, predicted eclipses, accounted for planetary motions with geometric precision. Why reject it? They developed sophisticated mathematics. Algebra, advanced geometry, trigonometry, numerical methods for solving equations. They could handle complex calculations, create astronomical tables, analyze geometric problems. But they didn't have calculus, didn't have analytical geometry, didn't have the mathematical tools that would become crucial to physics in the 17th century and beyond. This limited what problems they could solve, what phenomena they could model mathematically. In medicine, they understood many diseases empirically, could describe symptoms accurately, had effective treatments for many conditions. They understood that some diseases were contagious, though they didn't know about germs. They understood anatomy to the extent they could learn it from dissection of animals and limited human dissection. They had sophisticated pharmacology, effective surgical techniques, systematic approaches to diagnosis and treatment. But they didn't understand infection. They didn't know about bacteria and viruses, couldn't see microorganisms, didn't understand how diseases actually spread or what caused them. Their theory of humours and temperaments inherited from Galen was wrong as biology, but occasionally useful as a framework for thinking about health and disease. They couldn't cure many diseases we now treat routinely. Life expectancy was low, infant mortality high, epidemics devastating. In chemistry, or alchemy as it was then, they understood many practical chemical processes. They could distill, crystallize, combine substances, create medicines and dyes and alloys. They had systematic knowledge of many substances and their properties. They developed laboratory techniques and equipment that would form the basis of modern chemistry. But they didn't understand atoms or molecules, didn't know chemical formulas, didn't understand chemical bonds or reactions at a fundamental level. Their theoretical framework of elements and qualities was wrong, though occasionally useful. The alchemical dream of transmuting lead to gold was impossible, not because they lacked skill, but because it required changing atomic structure in ways no chemical reaction can accomplish. In physics, they understood many practical principles. They knew about levers and pulleys, about centers of gravity, about how light reflects and refracts. They had sophisticated understanding of optics, of mechanics as it applied to engineering and astronomy. They could build complex machines, calculate forces and angles, design structures that stood for centuries. But they didn't have Newton's laws of motion, didn't understand gravity as a universal force, didn't know about conservation of energy or momentum as we now understand these principles. They couldn't predict planetary orbits with the precision Newtonian mechanics allows. They couldn't explain why things fall or why planets move in the ways they do beyond describing the motions geometrically. This pattern repeats across fields. In every area there was sophisticated understanding within certain limits, remarkable achievement using available tools and concepts, but also fundamental limitations imposed by not having certain key insights, certain technologies, certain theoretical frameworks. They couldn't know what they couldn't know. The very questions that would lead to later breakthroughs often couldn't be formulated without insights that weren't yet available. Should we fault them for these limitations? Of course not. Every era of science has limits, things it can't yet know, questions it can't yet ask. Our science today has limits we don't fully recognize, blind spots we can't see, questions our descendants will ask that we haven't imagined. The scientists of the future will look back at us and see both our achievements and our limitations, just as we look back at Islamic Golden Age science. What's remarkable isn't what they didn't know, but what they achieved within their limitations. They pushed understanding as far as it could go with the tools available. They developed methods and approaches that remained valuable even when specific theories were superseded. They demonstrated that systematic inquiry, careful observation, rigorous thinking could produce knowledge, even if that knowledge was incomplete or sometimes wrong in detail. The humility this should inspire is worth feeling. Knowledge is hard-won and always incomplete. What seems obviously true might be wrong or oversimplified. What we take for granted might be questioned by future generations. The best we can do is work carefully within our limitations, advance understanding as far as we can, preserve what we learn for those who come after. This is what Islamic Golden Age scholars did, and it's what scientists in every age must do. There's something beautiful in the incompleteness, in the sense that there's always more to discover, that human knowledge is an ongoing project never finished. The scholars of the Golden Age knew they didn't have all the answers. They explicitly acknowledged uncertainty, marked speculations as such, admitted when they didn't know. This epistemic humility, combined with confidence that inquiry was worthwhile, characterizes the best science in any era. And perhaps what matters most isn't whether they were right about everything, but whether they asked good questions, developed sound methods, valued truth over comfort, sought understanding despite difficulties. On these criteria, Islamic Golden Age science succeeded admirably. It asked how the world works and tried to find out through observation and reason. It valued knowledge for its own sake while recognizing its practical uses. It built institutions and traditions that supported sustained inquiry. These achievements remain admirable regardless of what later ages would discover. Walk into any library and you'll find traces of the Islamic Golden Age, though you might not recognize them at first. Open a mathematics textbook and see quote 14 in the chapter headings, quote 15 in the index. Read a chemistry book and notice words like quote 16, quote 17, quote 18. Study astronomy and encounter stars with Arabic names, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Aldebaran. These aren't just linguistic borrowings. They're traces of knowledge transmission, evidence of a time when Arabic was the language of science, when Islamic civilization was the world's intellectual center. The mathematical legacy is particularly direct. Every time we solve an equation, we're using methods systematized by Al-Khwarizmi. Every time we use algorithms in computer science, we're following approaches named after him. The Arabic numerals we use, with their place value system and zero, transformed mathematics by making calculations vastly easier than with Roman numerals. Try multiplying MCMLXIV by DCCCXLVIII, and you'll appreciate what Arabic numerals made possible. The scientific method, that systematic approach of hypothesis, observation, experiment, and conclusion, has roots partly in Islamic science. Ibn al-Haytham's experimental method, his careful design of controlled experiments to test specific hypotheses, his combination of observation and mathematical analysis, all prefigure modern scientific practice. The insistence that theories must match observation, that authority can be questioned, that claims should be tested, these principles were demonstrated in Islamic science before becoming standard in European science. Medical practices and institutions carry the legacy forward. The hospital as an institution combining treatment, teaching and research builds on Islamic models. The emphasis on clinical observation, on careful case histories, on comparing treatments to see what works, all of this has roots in Islamic medicine. Specific medical knowledge has been superseded, but the approach, the systematic empirical method of trying to understand and treat disease continues. Libraries and universities as institutions supporting sustained scholarship owe something to Islamic models. The European university, emerging in the 12th and 13th centuries, was partly inspired by the madrasas and other Islamic educational institutions. The library as a public or semi-public institution, the endowment supporting institutions across generations, the recognition that society benefits from supporting scholarship. All of these have precedence in Islamic institutions. The architectural influence is visible in buildings across Europe and beyond. Gothic architecture's use of pointed arches was influenced by Islamic architecture. The intricate geometric patterns in Islamic art influenced European decorative arts. The palace gardens, the courtyards with fountains, the integration of water and architecture. These aesthetic principles travelled from the Islamic world to influence European and eventually global architectural traditions. But perhaps the most important legacy is less tangible: the demonstration that science and learning can flourish anywhere, in any culture, under any religion, when conditions support inquiry. For centuries, European scholars had assumed that great science and philosophy were achievements of ancient Greece and Rome, that medieval Europeans were lesser beings incapable of matching ancient greatness. The discovery of Islamic science challenged this narrative. If Islamic civilization could achieve such heights, if scholars writing in Arabic could advance beyond the Greeks, then human intellectual capacity wasn't limited to particular peoples or places. This had radical implications. It suggested that decline wasn't inevitable, that knowledge could advance rather than merely being preserved, that any civilization with the right conditions, political stability, economic prosperity, cultural value on learning, institutional support, could achieve great things. This gave hope to European scholars that they too might advance knowledge, might discover new things rather than just recovering old wisdom. The Islamic Golden Age modelled what was possible. The cosmopolitan character of Islamic science, the way it drew on Greek, Persian, Indian and other sources, synthesizing them into something new, offers a model for how knowledge advances. Science isn't the property of any single culture. It's a human endeavour, built through exchange and synthesis, through borrowing and building on others' work. The scholars of the Golden Age understood this. They didn't just preserve Greek knowledge, they combined it with Persian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Chinese technology, their own observations and insights, creating something that transcended any single tradition. This model of knowledge as cosmopolitan and cumulative, rather than the property of one culture or requiring pure originality, is worth remembering. In our time, scientific knowledge is even more international, built by researchers across the globe, published in journals accessible worldwide, tested and verified by people from many backgrounds. The internet has created conditions for knowledge exchange that would have amazed medieval scholars, but the principle is the same. Knowledge advances through exchange and collaboration, not isolation. The ethical commitments embedded in Islamic Golden Age science also continue to resonate. The idea that knowledge should be used for human benefit, that learning is a sacred duty, that truth is valuable for its own sake, that the pursuit of understanding is a noble calling. All of these values were expressed in the writings of Islamic scholars. These aren't uniquely Islamic values, but they were lived and demonstrated in that time and place, and they've been passed down through generations of scholars in various traditions. When we trace these threads forward, we see that the Islamic Golden Age isn't just historical curiosity. It's part of our intellectual lineage, regardless of our cultural background. The knowledge created then contributed to the knowledge we have now. The methods developed then influenced methods we use now. The values affirmed then resonate with values we still hold. We're inheritors of that tradition whether we know it or not, beneficiaries of work done centuries ago by people whose names we might never have heard. And this creates an obligation. We inherit not just knowledge but responsibility for preserving and extending it, for passing it to future generations, for honouring the work of those who came before by building on it. The scholars of the Golden Age did this, preserving Greek knowledge while extending it. European scholars did this, building on Islamic science while taking it in new directions. We must do the same, recognising that we're part of a long chain of human inquiry, each generation preserving what's been learned while discovering what it can. There's a particular kind of melancholy in contemplating lost knowledge, in thinking about the books that burned, the observations never recorded, the insights that died with their thinkers. The Islamic Golden Age produced far more than survives. For every text we have, how many were lost? For every scholar whose name we know, how many vanished from history, leaving no trace? We can't know precisely, but we know the losses were substantial, and that knowledge creates a kind of gentle sadness. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad's libraries, when Cordoba's books were scattered or destroyed, when countless individual manuscripts decayed or burned or were simply thrown away by people who didn't recognize their value, human knowledge was lost. Not all of it, thankfully. Some works survived in multiple copies, in different cities and libraries. Some knowledge was so fundamental, so widely known, that it persisted even when specific texts were lost. But some was lost utterly, surviving only in references and quotations, tantalizing hints of what once existed. Imagine a mathematical treatise explaining a method no longer known, a medical text describing treatments that worked, but whose recipes are lost, a philosophical work arguing for positions no one would think to argue now because the questions it addressed have been forgotten. These losses weren't just of data or techniques. They were losses of perspectives, of ways of thinking, of questions and approaches that might have enriched our understanding if they'd survived. But there's another way to think about lost knowledge that's perhaps less melancholy. Knowledge once created leaves traces even when the specific texts are lost. If a mathematical method works, if it solves problems, it tends to get rediscovered even if the original formulation is lost. If a medical treatment is effective, people notice and preserve the knowledge even if they don't preserve the theoretical explanation. If a philosophical insight is profound, it influences people who then influence others, creating chains of influence that persist even when the original work doesn't. This suggests that knowledge has a kind of resilience. The most valuable, most useful, most profound knowledge tends to survive in some form even through catastrophic losses. It might not survive in its original formulation. The specific words might be lost. But the insight, the method, the understanding finds new expressions, gets reinvented, resurfaces in different forms. Human understanding, when it's genuine, has a way of persisting. Think about Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra. Even if his original texts had been completely lost, the methods he systematized were so useful that they spread widely, were taught to countless students, influenced how people thought about mathematics. Even without the original texts, algebraic thinking would have survived because it works, because it's useful, because once you understand it, you see its value. The specific formulation matters less than the insight itself. This doesn't mean we shouldn't mourn what's lost. We should. Every lost text is a tragedy, a diminishment of human heritage. The scholars who wrote those texts worked hard, thought carefully, had insights we might benefit from. Their work deserved preservation, and its loss is real. But we can also find some comfort in knowing that the most important knowledge, the deepest understanding, has ways of surviving even through catastrophe. The losses also teach us about the fragility of knowledge and the importance of preservation. Knowledge doesn't preserve itself. Books decay, institutions fall, traditions are interrupted. Without active effort to copy manuscripts, maintain libraries, teach students, translate texts, knowledge can be lost. This creates an obligation for each generation to preserve what it inherits and pass it on. Our own age has new tools for preservation. Digital copies can be made easily and distributed widely, creating redundancy that makes loss less likely. The internet allows instant global access to vast amounts of knowledge. These technologies create opportunities for preservation that medieval scholars couldn't imagine. But they also create new vulnerabilities. Digital formats become obsolete, storage media degrade, institutions fail. We shouldn't assume that our knowledge is secure just because we have new technologies. The example of the Islamic Golden Age suggests that we should preserve broadly, not knowing what future generations will value. Some works considered crucial in their time seem less important now. Some works neglected in their time became influential later. We can't predict what will matter to the future, so we should preserve what we can, recognizing that judgment about value changes across time. There's also a lesson about the conditions that support knowledge preservation. Libraries need funding, institutions need stability, scribes and scholars need support. When these conditions deteriorate, when political instability disrupts institutions, when economic decline reduces resources available for preservation, knowledge is at risk. Creating resilient institutions, maintaining cultural commitment to preservation, ensuring redundancy through multiple copies in different locations, all of these help protect knowledge. And perhaps most importantly, the example of the Islamic Golden Age teaches us that knowledge transmission across cultures is crucial. When one civilization declines, if its knowledge has been transmitted to others, it can survive and even flourish in new contexts. The Greek knowledge preserved in Arabic, later transmitted to Latin, survived in multiple forms across multiple civilizations. This redundancy across cultural boundaries provided insurance against local catastrophes. In our globalized world, knowledge is already international, created and shared across civilizations. This creates resilience against local decline. If any one region or civilization faces catastrophe, knowledge can survive elsewhere. But this requires openness, communication across cultures, willingness to learn from others and share with them. The cosmopolitan character of knowledge creation and transmission in the Islamic Golden Age offers a model worth emulating. The losses from the Golden Age remind us that nothing is guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost, that civilizations can decline, that what seems permanent can prove fragile. But they also remind us that human understanding, once achieved, has a kind of resilience, that the most valuable knowledge finds ways to survive, that even after catastrophe, intellectual recovery is possible. Both the fragility and the resilience are real, both deserving of our attention, both shaping how we should think about our own knowledge and our obligation to preserve and transmit it. We've travelled together for 2.5 hours now, drifting slowly back through 12 centuries, meeting scholars and physicians, mathematicians and astronomers, philosophers and engineers. We've stood by the Tigris River and watched a city rise. We've walked through libraries holding thousands of manuscripts. We've looked through astrolabes at the stars, mixed substances in alchemical workshops, read medical texts by lamplight, traced geometric patterns in mosque decorations. We've contemplated what was achieved and what was lost, what they knew and what they couldn't know, how knowledge travels across time and cultures. From Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra to Ibn al-Haytham's optics, from Al-Razi's medicine to the observatories that map the stars, we've seen how human curiosity, when supported and valued, can create something that outlasts any individual life, any single civilization. We've seen how knowledge builds cumulatively, each generation adding to what came before, how learning can flourish anywhere when conditions are right, how wisdom has no single source but many. The answer, as honestly as I can give it, to the question of what the Islamic Golden Age means, what we should take from it, is this. It demonstrates that human intellectual achievement is possible anywhere, in any culture, under any religion. When curiosity is valued and inquiry supported, it shows that knowledge travels, that civilizations learn from each other, that what one age achieves can benefit later ages even after the original civilization has declined. And it reminds us that we inherit not just knowledge but responsibility, the obligation to preserve what we've received, to add what we can, to pass it all forward as best we're able. If you enjoyed this slow drift through history's quieter corners, if you found something valuable in these stories of human striving and achievement, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video, subscribe to the channel, maybe leave a comment sharing what resonated with you. These gestures help reach others seeking peaceful ways to learn and rest. And to those already part of this community, thank you for being here, for making this work possible, for valuing thoughtful exploration of what came before. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever time it is where you're watching or listening, I hope you're comfortable, hope your breathing has slowed and deepened, hope your thoughts have quieted, hope your body feels heavy and warm and ready for rest. I hope the day's concerns have faded, at least for now, leaving space for this older story, these longer timescales, this perspective that comes from looking back across centuries. Look up at the stars if you can, wherever you are. Those are the same stars that Islamic astronomers measured and mapped, the same celestial sphere they sought to understand. Think of Al-Tusi and Maragay, night after night recording planetary positions. Think of the astrolabe makers creating tools beautiful enough to be art, precise enough to be science. Think of all those people who looked up at this same sky and asked the same questions we ask. How far? How old? What does it mean? They didn't have all the answers, and neither do we. But they looked and measured and calculated and thought, and in doing so they gave us something precious. The night is quiet and vast. The stars are distant and beautiful and indifferent, but the human desire to understand them, to measure their positions and predict their movements, to find patterns in what seems random, to comprehend the cosmos, that's not indifferent. That's deeply human, precious, worth honouring. The scholars of the Islamic Golden Age dedicated their lives to that project, to understanding, and we benefit from their work whether we know it or not. Sleep well tonight. Dream, if you dream, of libraries by rivers, of astronomers at their instruments, of scholars carefully copying manuscripts by lamplight, of the long chain of human inquiry to which we all belong. Dream of knowledge travelling across centuries and cultures, of wisdom finding new homes, of understanding advancing slowly, patiently across generations. Dream of a time when the whole world's learning gathered in one city, when curiosity was rewarded, when asking questions was valued as much as finding answers, and wake tomorrow part of that same tradition, inheritor of all that work, with your own contribution to make to the ongoing human project of understanding our world and our place in it. Good night, rest well. Thank you for this journey through time together.